All right, well, welcome everybody to this webinar for our grand rounds today for the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Louisville. I'm Dr. David Casey, chair of the department, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. And our speaker is Dr. Erik Goodwyn. Dr. Goodwyn is currently serving as an associate professor in our department. He's a longtime faculty member. He's had a number of important roles in the department, most notably director of psychotherapy education. He's also played an important role in our clinic and with student health and has gained a great deal of expertise in telehealth. He's one of the region's, if not the nation's, experts in practicing and teaching various forms of psychodynamic psychotherapy, including in particular Jungian therapy and the use of dream material in psychotherapy, and he teaches widely and writes widely about this topic. He's a prolific author, in fact, having authored numerous publications and books. I'm very jealous of his facility as a writer, in fact. He's a graduate of Western Kentucky University, summa cum laude, and also earned a master's in anatomy and neurobiology from that institution. He's a medical graduate of the University of Cincinnati and did his residency at Wright State. And I believe Wright State is a long-time kind of affiliate of the Air Force. And he served in the Air Force, reaching the rank of major, served in various capacities, in particular as director of psychiatric services at Minot Air Force Base, which I think is in North Carolina, or I should say North Dakota, not North Carolina, long way from those two. He was the clinic chief there. He has expertise in many other areas, including PTSD, anxiety disorders, student mental health, just to name a few. He's the recipient of a number of awards, including important teaching awards, and therefore it's been a great honor and pleasure to have him serve on our faculty. Unfortunately, we're in the last weeks of his service here as he's preparing to move back to the West, to Montana, in fact. So he's going to be missed around here, and we hope that he finds the mountains a little too isolated and wants to come back home as quickly as possible.
You never know.
So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Goodwyn, and I'm sure we're all going to enjoy his presentation. So Dr. Goodwyn, thanks. We're going to miss you, and good luck. And turning it over to you for your presentation.
All right, thank you. Let's see, how do I get the slides up here? Yeah. All right, here we go. So it's going to be a fun talk today. We're going to talk about the collective unconscious. So here's the required slide that Christy made me put up here. Do with it what you will. Well, moving on. So chances are you've heard of the collective unconscious, but you may not know what it is. And unfortunately, for some reason, Jung's theory has attracted the attention of all sorts of various groups outside of academia, and they love to use and abuse his concepts. But serious scholarship on these concepts has continued after his death in 1961. And I thought I'd talk about the collective unconscious today, which you can't talk about that without getting into archetypes, which we'll also get into. And just kind of give you an overview of what some of the current thought is on this thing, and what is it, and how is it, most importantly, how can you use it? How can you use this conceptualization in therapy? So we'll start off with the man himself here. This is how he defines it. It's a psychic system of collective, universal, and impersonal nature. It's identical in all individuals. It does not develop individually. It's inherited. And it consists of pre-existent forms, the archetypes. We can only become conscious of them secondarily, in which give definite form to certain psychic contents. So now, to say that that's a difficult definition is to probably understate it. I think the problem is that he was really grasping at an intuition that he at the time had a difficult time to sometimes define. But what he was really getting at is that we have not only all of the stuff that we've learned, but we also have this system that's there that's just exists because of our evolutionary history. Now, another problem he ran into is that evolutionary theory was not particularly advanced at the time of his writing. And of course, now we have a whole lot more to say about these sorts of things. But essentially, in a later definition, he tightens it up a little bit, and he says, basically, it's just an inherited tendency of the human mind, an inherited tendency to form representations of mythological motifs, things that you see across the globe that vary a lot but have the same basic structure. So that was his hypothesis at the time. It is continuously active throughout life, and it acts in addition to learned responses. Okay, so this will become more clear as we go. But first, I want to talk about why do we care? So what does this add, if anything? It's basically, if we don't think of the psyche as having something like this, then we have to assume that whatever it is that they are, however they respond, however a person responds to life, is because of something they learned. And that might sound reasonable on the surface, but when you get deeper into it, it really doesn't make much sense, because we have so many responses to environmental conditions that are just there because we happen to be Homo sapiens and we happen to be mammals and all that. And there's a lot of continuity across the animal species. But if we look at it this way, we can say then that any given response, there's going to be a system that responds to what we experience that is based on what we have learned in our life. And then the other one is the so-called instinctive response. And often they get blended together into what you might see in the consulting room. So then how would it manifest? If you're largely seeing a response from the collective unconscious, it would manifest in a way that would feel kind of out of nowhere to the person, because they would not be able to link it to a particular memory, say. And I'll give you some examples here as we go. They would be independent of personal history. It might be something that like they've never really thought much about, and all of a sudden they've got this dream imagery. And they're like, what in the world, where did that come from, you know? And you can definitely see this when you start working with patients in long-term therapy. They are often very emotional because of the link between emotion and our evolutionary history. Just a quick, easy way to think about this is think about pain. So somehow we learn that putting our hand on a stove damages the tissues, right? But why? Because it hurts. Well, when did we learn that it hurts? When did we learn that we're supposed to feel pain when that happens? We don't learn that. It's built into the system. So that's what I'm getting at. You got to keep going deeper and deeper to get at this stuff. And a lot of it we take for granted because everybody has it and it's just instinctive. So it's always going on in the background. So we'll bring this out of the abstract here. Let's talk about something more concrete, easier to understand. So the cold response is a good illustration of what I'm getting at here. If you were raised in Hawaii, right, and you never experienced anything but 85 degrees, and all of a sudden you walk into, you get on a plane and you fly to Finland and you get out and all of a sudden you're shivering and all of this stuff is going on in your body. That's what I'm talking about. That is an instinctive response. You never learned that you're supposed to shiver when you're cold. Your tissues didn't learn that they're supposed to shift perfusion away from the skin and towards the internal organs. And yet we do it anyway. Why? Well, it's because of our ancestral history, our biological history. It has nothing to do with our personal history. So if you keep that in mind, you'll have an idea of what I'm talking about. In therapy, our day-to-day activities and interactions, sometimes the response will be more instinctive, like the cold response. You'll start shivering, as it were, rather than it always being based on something that you have run into before. Now, that said, most responses are combinations, and it takes some skill to learn how to parse out what's what. And you'll learn how to do that today. Most responses will have combinations of learned, so like, for example, with the cold response, if you go out there and you start shivering, okay, but then you also go and get a coat because you learned that that helps you stay warmer. Right? That's not inborn, that's learned. So it's a combination of those two things is what you'll see, and you'll have to figure out what's what. And as we go, I'll also show you why it matters, why it makes a difference to be able to differentiate them. And as an example, you might have a patient sharing a story or a dream, a memory, a work of art Some of that stuff that they're producing will have archetypal origins to it. It'll be instinctive. That's what archetypal means. It's universal. It's independent of your own particular history, but based more on our ancestral history. So things that come from the collective unconscious are impersonal psychological responses. There'll be aspects of dreams, of things reported in, altered states of consciousness even, or under the influence of drugs sometimes. Some people think that psychotic expressions are very much like this. Actually, where Jung got his start, and he, at early part of his career, he worked in the Bergholzi Clinic in Switzerland, and it was very severely mentally ill patients there, and they didn't have Haldol back in that time, and so they a lot of times had to work with folks without very much in the way of medical interventions. But he did spend a lot of time with them, and he was very fascinated with their wild psychotic stories, but he started to notice that some of them seem to have this mythological structure to them. And as you go, if you study this any amount, you'll start to get a little spider sense when you hear it. You're like, that sounds like a mythological thing there. I'm gonna go look it up and see if I can find it somewhere else. And then when you do, it's like, whoa, this is cool. Yeah, so creative inspiration is another one. If somebody has a spontaneous creative activity. So let me give you an example. I'm gonna share two stories with you. Okay, so first story, long ago, the moon married the sun. The moon slept at day while the sun slept at night. They had many children. The bright burning sons followed their father, but he became annoyed with them and sent them to go live with their grandmother in the rivers and the streams. They became the fish. The soft glowing daughters, however, stayed with their mother in the sky. Those are the stars. That's story one. And story two, long ago, Miss Moon married the sun. And the sun is awake during the day and Miss Moon is awake at night. And their children are all of the stars. Very similar stories, right? Okay. So number one is a traditional Yoruba myth from Western Africa. And the other one, my granddaughter told me out of the blue for no apparent reason, as we were wandering around in my driveway, and she looked up at the sky and she told me this long story. And I'm like, and that's what I'm saying is that I heard that and I'm like, that sounds mythological in structure. So, thankfully her granddad is me, and I can look that up for him, because I'm sure she was really worried about that. Boy, you should hear her stories now. She's 4. They're out there. But I mean, that's how children are. It's imagination. But some of the stuff that is used by the imagination is innate stuff, and some of it is learned stuff. And that's what we're getting at today. So here's another quote from Jung. He's talking about archetypes. There are as many of these as there are typical situations in life. Basically saying that's how they work. That's why they're there, because you have enough typical situations that can wind up, in modern terms, it can wind up on the genome through selective pressure over a long period of time. Endless repetition, as he puts it, and he didn't know about selection or any of that stuff, but he just is intuiting here that endless repetition would be how these things get engraved into our psychic constitution in the form of image, not with images per se, but with forms that our learned experience then fill in. So what we inherit really is kind of the skeletal form of these images, and then what we learn gets kind of put in there. You'll see how this works later as we go. So an archetype then is a combination of the innate and the learned put together. And that will be things like images and narratives of that you see repeated around the world. Like, there's a Beauty and the Beast type story in almost every culture studied. Same thing with Cinderella. And this is one argument for why that is, because it's in our constitution, our psychic constitution, as it were, that there's instincts of the imagination that just kick in and will tell the same kind of story, and we love it, right? We hear it over and over and over again. So there's some scholars who think that the Indo-European version of the Beauty and the Beast story is like 4,000 or 5,000 years old. And that's, that we know of. Obviously, you can only go so far back, and then you don't know, maybe they told it before then, who knows? So it takes a really special story to survive that long, an oral transmission, especially. But more specifically now, an archetype is not just any story or image. It's something that's symbolic. So it's a picture that represents something else, that's something more meaningful or emotionally significant. And then it's psychologically resonant. It's something that is sticky. When you hear it, it's easy to remember, and you tell it and other people hear it. It's not like a joke, right? So a joke, you hear it and it kind of spreads and then it kind of fizzles out because people are tired of hearing it. No, a resonant story is something that you go to back over and over again, kind of like kids who want to hear the same story over and over again. With me, it was Jack and the Beanstalk. That probably drove my dad crazy with that one. So that's great. That's what an archetype is. What isn't an archetype? And this is something you have to be careful when you get into the literature on this, is that some scholars are a little bit messy with this, and they want to identify everything as an archetype practically, and that drives me bonkers. But we're too smart for that here, because you're going to listen to me. And an archetype, what isn't one, is things that aren't images or narratives, like a cake recipe, for example. It's not an archetype. It's got to be symbolic for it to count. So a picture of a snake, if it's just a sign saying, watch out, there's snakes, that's not a symbol. Not in the sense that we're talking about here. The caduceus, however, which has snakes in it, is a symbol because it has two snakes doing things that snakes never do, which is wrap around like this up a stick and then to reach the wings. And it's actually comes from the staff of Hermes Trismegistus, who was a very important figure in ancient alchemy and all that. And if we could go on a deep dive on the symbolism there, but I'll spare you that. Come see me later. Anyway, so if it's just a repeat or a reflection of something you have experienced, that's not an archetype, because we need the innate stuff for it to count. And then if it's not resonant, if it's not sticky, right, this is kind of the intangible factor of this, is that it's arresting or fascinating, then it also doesn't count either. So what makes up an archetype? Since they're symbols, they're metaphors. But what I'm saying is that they're mostly innate in origin, so they have to contain innate metaphors to them. So what do I mean by metaphor? Okay, so there's actually a very specific way of defining the term metaphor. And it's a visual spatial representation of something that is more difficult to describe. And it's a way that we kind of cheat when we're trying to understand things. We use it in our language all the time. For example, we talk about particularly someone's ideas being clear. What does that mean? How can an idea be clear? Okay, but you know what it means, right? Because it's using the metaphor of vision equaling knowledge. Okay, and that's an innate one. We'll get to why in a minute. And that's the example I'm using here. Darkness equals the unknown, or the villains are always wearing dark, that kind of thing in movies. So darkness represents the unknown for very simple innate biological reasons. So all of these innate metaphors can sometimes organize to create a full-blown archetype. And like I said, we'll see how that works. And they don't involve a whole lot of learning, or if they do involve any learning at all, it's not the kind of learning that we're typically thinking of when we're working with patients. Like, there's two really broad kinds of learning that it's important to distinguish. The kind of learning involved in teaching yourself how to walk, I don't really count that, because everyone does it, and it doesn't matter what your environment is, you're going to do it. So that's going to be more along the innate side of what we're talking about. The ability to play Beethoven's, Für Elisa, for example, though, that's learning, right? Because you have to sit down and learn it, and you do it, and you practice it, and you learn from someone else, or you learn from observation. We know that learning to walk doesn't require observation, because people who are born blind teach themselves how to walk. And they can do a whole lot of other stuff too. That's pretty impressive. So it's just a natural way that the psyche develops. In other words, they're impersonal in nature. So the next 3 slides I'm going to shotgun a bunch of these innate metaphors at you. And we'll go through the justification for them so that you can learn how to see them as you go when you're listening to dream content, for example. Listen to this also in your patients' early memories too, because they often have this sort of mythological structure to them. It's because they're so early that they're largely imagination based. And because of the way memory works, the further away, it's got a fisheye lens effect, right? So the further away it is from where right now, the more schematic it becomes and the more imagination fills in the gaps of what we don't really know. And yet it still feels like it's a real memory. But anyway, so here we go. So light is knowledge. We talked about that one. Why would that be there? Well, because we're visual creatures. We are diurnal mammals who largely are active during the day when there's a lot of light. And the visual system is set up for this. When it's dark, we're much more vulnerable and we're more clumsy. So it's a natural metaphor for the psyche to self-organize, that light is good and it represents knowledge because I can see all the things around me, versus darkness, which is unknown and it's scary, and it also can represent the unmanifest because we can't see it until we just shine the light on it. Now it's manifest. Funny how that works. Now, the counterexample to this, like, well, okay, what if rats could do this? What if rats could put together metaphors? What would they do? They would not use this metaphor at all because they hate the light. They're more vulnerable in the light. They run away. They're scent oriented. So for them, light equals danger and darkness and evil. Okay, but we're not rats, most of us anyway. So the light and the dark represent two innate metaphors that you will see used. And it's not just used in content from your therapist. Artists use this. Movie makers make a great use of this. Whether or not they know that they're using it for psychological reasons doesn't matter because they just feel it and it makes sense and people get it. So they don't really need to know. Cold is social isolation. This is another one that's innate. And the reason is because the neural structures involved in social bonding evolved from those that were mediating our temperature regulation responses. So on a certain level, social isolation and loneliness feels cold for that reason. And this is not anything that anyone needs to really learn. So if you have a patient, say, comes in and they're dreaming about being lost in a blizzard, well, I already have a good clue as to what it might be about. It might be about them feeling alone or isolated. So you can start to see how using these and as guides can help you figure out what these expressions might mean. By the same token, you've got heat, which represents, well, on one side you get warmth, which is social connection, again, for the same reason. It just feels warmer, when you have that. And then heat and fire are often used to represent intense affect. And I think the reason why that is because when we are enraged, for example, or in other certain physiological states that are intense, our temperature literally goes up. So it's an easy connection for metaphor creation to go to that letter of the alphabet, as it were, and use it. So if you have a patient that say they're dreaming of being in a house that's on fire, I might have a rough idea of what's going on there, and I can pursue that. So again, it doesn't give you exact meanings. It gives you guides to help you figure out what's going on. A person is a complex, intentful process, right? That's just personification. Happens around 3, maybe earlier. And it's another tool that we use when we're forming metaphors. I remember, so my granddaughter's been great examples for me to use because I've been watching her grow up while I'm thinking about this stuff. And I remember one point she was walking along and she tripped over the leg of a table and turned around and said, "No." So that's personification. And then before that, she came to me with a teddy bear. She was about 2, I think. And she informed me the teddy bear needed nap and needed a blankie, And you look at, you think about it, you hear it, it's really cute and all that, but you don't think that there's a lot going on in that, actually, that process. She's personifying various things in her environment. And that's a natural human thing to do because we're so intensely social. Other persons, right, theory of mind, if you've got any psychology background, you know what that is. The ability to guess at the intent in others. That's super important in humans because our go-to strategy for survival has been work together as a team to survive. I mean, we don't survive that great on our own, okay, in the evolutionary environment. Just wandering around in the wilderness by yourself, it's a bit of a dicey proposition, right? You need lots of other humans. Well, the only thing that motivates that is a very strong orientation towards others, personification, which is to help figure out what those others are thinking so that you can either work with them or against them or whatever you got to do. And so that's behind this innate metaphor. Some more. The center. This, you hear this in language all the time. What's the central issue? Why the hell does it have to be the central issue? What's so great about the center? What's great about it is because of the way our eyes set up. Like the fovea is in the center. And all of the organization of the retina is based on the idea that you're going to look at the most important thing and it's going to be in the center. That's just how it builds. So it's a natural metaphor for us to use that everyone's going to understand, except maybe the people born blind. But that doesn't ever have, it didn't have to be that way. It could have been the upper left, right? And that's the most important. But it isn't. And it's the other thing we take for granted because it's just part of everyone's experience. Nobody's experienced anything differently. You know, maybe if aliens came down, they'd have all kinds of weird metaphors we wouldn't get. But that hasn't happened yet, as far as I know. There's another one, water. Water is used in dream symbolism all the time. And water can be, it has a two-pronged use. And because we have a kind of ambivalent relationship to water, on one hand, we need it to survive, right? So that's an innate metaphor that will find itself into expressions. But it's also hostile and we can't breathe in it. You know, it's hostile in the sense that if you go in there, you can't breathe and you'll choke to death and die. And so there's the mystery and the danger and the unknown. And it's, of course, a lot of times it's dark too. That just adds that another layer to it. Size equals power. Right, this is a big issue that we're talking about here. Right, I need to get on top of this problem. It's so pervasive, you don't notice it unless you start thinking about it. But this is a very simple one. If you, number one, we are upright walking organisms. So there's already a preference for up versus falling over, where you're more vulnerable. That's bad. So it's going to be in the genome pretty much. But then, of course, everyone also has the experience that the big people have all the power and they tell us what to do. So, and that's going to be one of those things that everyone teaches themselves. Symmetry equals conceptual harmony, right? Everyone is now in balance. The issue has balanced itself out. Why is that there? Well, again, it goes back to physiology. Upright balanced position is preferred to not. And there's also a preference for symmetrical mate choice in way more than just humans. And in fact, any animal with bilateral symmetry is going to have this innate preference for symmetrical others versus asymmetrical, because it's a sign of fitness. So that's just hardwired in. Although I hate to use that metaphor. Never mind. Anyway, facial expressions equals emotional states. People who are born blind smile when they're happy. Why? I mean, there's no reason why they would necessarily have to. They didn't learn it anywhere. They didn't see anybody smiling, and yet they do. Same thing with frowns and all of that. There's even some studies of Olympics involving folks that were blind or deaf or whatever, and they for the born blind ones, they would look at the different displays when they would win an event versus lose, and when they win, they expand up, and they yay, you know, this sort of thing. But they haven't seen anybody do that, so why are they doing that? Versus losing, they shrink down, and they're like, you know. So those subtle movements have an innate basis to them. Because victory and winning means dominance, right? So you're going to expand yourself and make yourself bigger versus I lost, so I'm going to go shuffle away, you know, nobody will bother me. Same thing with facial expressions. So in cultural expressions that involve faces, it's going to be innate in there. What if there's any resemblance whatsoever to a frown, for example, you're going to know immediately that's going to be linked to that emotion, anger or sadness or happiness or whatever. One more, and then we'll stop. An object is an idea. This is the metaphor you use when you say you've got a real good grasp on the subject. You're treating the subject as if it were an object that you're grasping, or I'm trying to understand. I'm understanding this thing. I'm going to turn this idea around in my head. So everybody understands the metaphors. So what's up with that? It's a shorthand. It's a way that we use to try to organize difficult concepts by treating them as if they were objects and shuffling them around in our kind of visual spatial memory. And by the same token, moving objects will represent dramatic or dynamic concepts. So this is for example, in the love is a journey metaphor that you see used a lot. We're at different places in our relationship right now. We're going in different directions. We're hitting a rocky road. We're just using our relationship, and the metaphor for that is a journey. So you're taking this really kind of difficult, nebulous sort of idea of a relationship, and you're making it easier to understand by treating it as if it were an object moving around. And most of these involve the same kind of process. Cyclical movement represents a recurrent process. So we're going through cycles and spirals, right? This is used a lot in Neolithic artwork. And I'm on a different path than I used to be now. Same type of thing. And then another one you'll see a lot is twinning or tripling. You see this in dreams, especially. If whatever it is that this person is being personified to represent, if you see two or three of them, it's a way that their brain is representing amplification of that idea, or multiplication, or even differentiation. Okay, enough of that. So what? So we're constantly making symbolic images and narratives all the time. It's a way that we use to try to make sense of the world. And what differentiates some of these narratives, whether they're self-narratives or memories or dreams or whatever, is whether or not they use these archetypal elements to them. These are these innate metaphors, or ones that they learn, right? So an example of one that we learn would be the use of money to represent power. This, again, you'll see this in dreams a lot too, but that's not archetypal, it's not innate, because not every culture has currency. So it wouldn't make sense for someone to understand or self-create that metaphor in a culture where you didn't use currency. Nevertheless, in those that do, it gets grabbed up pretty quickly by the psyche, and it'll use it a lot. So here's a great example, right? This is a patient of mine. And this is a herald dream. So a herald dream is a special name we give to the first dream that the patient reports to you in therapy. And it's usually right before they came in, they have a big dream. I'm going to the spa or the gym with my sister. We find a machine that is supposed to make us healthy, but we're not sure if we're allowed to use it, but we get in it anyway. Suddenly it closes us in this great big black egg-shaped apparatus, and we start to tumble through it. It gets dark, and we start progressing through cycles. My sister is panicking. Both of us tumbling through in the fetal position. I reassure her that it'll be okay, but actually I'm not sure it'll ever end. But then it does, it opens up and the manager's there. Okay, so is this an archetypal dream? And I'm going to contend that it is, and explain why. It does have combinations of innate and learned elements, like most dreams. It is symbolic and is a narrative, like most dreams are. And it has a lot of emotional content. Is it psychologically resonant, though? That was that one last piece. And it is, and you can show that it is if you can find evidence that has been independently invented somewhere else, or it's been passed on down long times. And the example I use for this is alchemy. And alchemy is a great example because so few people know anything about it. It was a very ancient form of chemistry that wound up being more of a mystical practice. It was practiced for thousands of years. Until the advent of modern chemistry kind of overtook it and said, okay, alchemy is just a bunch of hocus pocus, because a lot of it was. I mean, if you're looking at it solely from the point of view of trying to understand physical matter, it's a bunch of nonsense. But psychologically, though, because the ancient alchemists were basically just cooking the stuff up in their imagination, it's got tons of archetypal stuff in it. So I use this, and Jung is the one who first identified this. And he used this a lot to understand things, because it's not coming from anything they learn. Most of the time, people don't study this stuff. It was focused mainly on transforming lead into gold, but then again, in a lot of treatises, it became more obvious that they were talking more about a mystical inner transformation of the psyche or the spirit. Obviously the chemistry is complete nonsense, but that's because it's mostly imaginative speculation. But here are some common themes that you see in alchemical tracts all over the world. Okay, the alchemist blends the minerals in an egg or a spherical shaped vessel that is likened to a womb. Very common. The alchemist has this Sora Mystica, spiritual sister, that works with him, and it was almost always males doing the writing here because, patriarchy. It involved a cyclical process. It required the use of heat. It had to be done in a sacred or separate area. It was deliberately linked to spiritual practice. They didn't divide mind and matter back then as we do, often incorrectly, I might add. Prima materia, the basic stuff that you use in alchemical tract, is almost always black. And yet, as you go through the stuff that you do, heat it up and turn it and do all of this stuff, it becomes gold, or it becomes the aquavita or the philosopher's stone or whatever. And through it, you achieve immortality and spiritual purity. So when she presented this dream, I was like, whoa, there's a lot of alchemical symbolism in this dream. And here it is, right? So she's got the turning, which is representative of psychological turmoil. Remember, that's an innate one. Heat is intense emotion. There's that one. The sphere, we didn't talk about this one, but it's in the symmetry one. A spherical object is perfectly symmetrical in all three dimensions. So it's the most symmetrical object mathematically. And the psyche uses it in that manner. Also the connection of the vessel to the womb. Remember, she said they were in the fetal position. So that's there too. The black equals the primordial energy of the machine. You're progressing towards a physical end through going through this, a psychological end by going through this physical process. That's in there. The presence of the sibling is in there even. And so there's tons of innate metaphors that she used to create this dream. She had no knowledge of alchemy. She's never heard of it. And I showed her this stuff and she's like, whoa, this is just. And that's remember when I said earlier, that's what you'll see. It'll feel like it's out of nowhere and like, what in the world? Where did that come from? Come from the collective unconscious. The surface details here are that you've got a gym, right? Although the gym is a sacred space, so it still kind of counts. It's a separate space, right? Not fully sacred in the spiritual sense, but I don't know, maybe to some people. But exercise machine is a giant egg. It does not work like any exercise machine that I've ever heard of. So it's another dead giveaway. If it's using stuff that you've experienced, but it's using it in a way that you've never run into, then that's where you look for the form of the innate. And exactly, the historical bits are not used in the way in which they were originally experienced, but they're using a creative new way to create this metaphor. All right, so she dreamed an archetype. Big deal. Who cares? These are timeless expressions, the form of them anyway. They come from all these combinations of innate metaphors. They're expressions not of personal individual meaning, but more archetypal meaning or universal historical meaning. So that's significant. And you have to kind of be careful when you share this stuff with people. If you identify that and they think they had this great big dream that's connected to the whole human race, it can get them ego inflated big time. But you have to kind of, say, all right, calm down now. Anybody could have this dream. It just connects us to things that anyone might have encountered, right? So going to therapy is a big deal for many people. It's daunting. If you've done it yourself, you know how this feels. And that's all it is. She's going into a cold environment and shivering. This is the response, and it's coming from the innate rather than the personal. But the thing is, just like the shivering response, it has a certain value to it. It's giving you not so much maybe a roadmap, but like, this is how this works. This is where you need to head in that direction. Okay. You're feeling cold, which means you need to do something about it, because cold is unpleasant. So it doesn't have all the answers, but it tells you which direction you might want to go. All right. And that's the value of these sorts of dreams. Other ones that are not archetypal may not have this quality to them. They can give you a lot of great info, but they won't necessarily have this timeless answers to ancient questions kind of feel to it. That's why they can be useful. So what they are useful for is to create meaning for your experience. It changes the meaning to identify it as such too. It's not just something that I cooked up in my little pea brain, but it's something that many people across the ages have run into. And so in some ways that kind of mitigates the issue, right? It connects us. And so there's some healing involved just in identifying that. That's very important. It can help to reverse the feeling of alienation, which is very common. Anyone who's done any research into loneliness problem that we have in our country and the Western world in general, it's a big problem. And in fact, recognizing that someone has an archetypal expression that just popped up in their head means now, okay, this is no longer just your problem. This is a humankind problem, or at least a culture-wide problem. So when I say it helps with meaning construction, what do I mean by meaning? What is meaning? It's not as abstruse as it might sound. It's very simply connection or context. So if I ask, what does this mean? What I'm asking is, how does this thing that I'm trying to figure out the meaning of connect to everything else around it? Once I figure that out, I have the meaning of it. Right? That's it. It doesn't come from some ancient wellspring of outer space or something. It's just connecting it all. And that's how I create meaning. How does this event relate to everything else that has happened to me? If you work with trauma patients, a big part of what they are struggling with is they don't understand what it means. Does it mean that I'm bad? Does it mean that I asked for it? Does it mean blah, 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 right? A huge amount of our work involves in helping them to forge a meaning for it. Same thing with grief. If you get into the literature on grief counseling, one of the big problems that patients come in with is, I can't make sense of this death. If it was sudden, right? Or if it was violent, or a suicide, for example, that's a tough one. And cultures all around the world recognize the difficulty of those particular kinds of grief, and they actually change their rituals, their death rituals, oftentimes to specialize and do more stuff for people that are going through a loss like that. Why? Because in those cases, those people need more meaning. If someone died at age 99, I don't need to, ponder too much to understand the meaning of, well, they were old, that's just how it goes. It's okay. There's the meaning is intact. I'm all right. Then you get into other stuff where meaning is super important too. And you might not notice this, but the meaning of like identity, like, I don't know where I fit in. I don't know who I am, right? If somebody says like, who are you? What do you tell them? Well, you can tell them, I'm from here, I'm married to this person, I have these many kids, blah, blah, blah. What am I doing? I'm listing off my connections to others. But a lot of folks have this, I don't know who I am business, and it's because of this disconnection, right? So the same thing applies. I'm trying to help them figure out the meaning of their place in the world. I got to connect stuff. So it's how do I relate? I can't emphasize enough how important this is, because if you really look at it, the brain is one of the biggest jobs that it has is to create meaning for your experiences. It's a meaning-making machine. It's constantly churning this. That's what memory's focused on. It's what dreams are focused on. I'm trying to figure out all of the stuff that's happened to me. I need to figure out what it means. And in a species that is so complex and socially complex as we are, that's super important, because we get a ton of info and we can do all kinds of stuff with it. And so a huge amount of our processing power, I think, goes towards this, okay, hell, this stuff happened, but I don't really know how it connects to everything else. And it's super important to do this, and we feel absolutely awful if we can't make sense of it. And one of the best ways that the brain uses to create meaning is through stories, because stories are narratives that connect a whole bunch of stuff together. They tie it all together in a nice, neat, easy to remember chunk. So these are universal therapy issues that are actually meaning issues. I don't know who I am, right? That means I don't know the meaning of my own particular existence on this globe. I don't understand why this is happening to me. these are questions you will hear a zillion times if you haven't already. What they're asking is, I don't know the meaning of the traumatic events. And sometimes even if for the existentialists and the absurdists out there, you can actually get some measure of comfort from the recognition and the acceptance that there is no meaning. But that is in itself a type of meaning, right? There's really no way to get out of this game. And the worst place is in the I don't know. That's the sweet spot that most of our patients are going to be presenting as. I think it might not mean anything, but I'm not sure. And that's misery right there. I don't know why I feel so bad, right? I got depression. I got anxiety. I got the bipolar, right? Well, I don't understand why though, you know? And so what do? We say, well, there's all of this knowledge about bipolar and depression, and it's all in your neurons, and you know, it's all about serotonin. That does help to a degree, but you need the rest of their story too, to help connect them to everyone else outside their little skulls. So don't forget that side of it. It's extremely important. That's why therapy and medications both really help. In combination, they're really good. I don't feel like I belong anywhere. I don't know how many times you're going to hear that, but start counting. That means that I don't know the meaning of my social standing. I don't know how I connect with everyone else. I don't feel like I belong, because the belonging means connection. Now, if we go back to the alchemy dream that Mrs. A had, notice how it gives the symbols that point you to possible answers here. You're going through this process, right? Getting to go into therapy is like getting into this machine. It's like turning around and turning up the heat. In other words, the psyche is saying, okay, this ain't going to be fun, but you need to do it. And your sister's coming along for the ride. Guess what? That one kind of came out of nowhere. I didn't understand the meaning of that until later. But the point is that if we're using all these innate metaphors, then we're going on evolutionary history and the kind of wisdom that has been selected into existence to help us along. Meaning and suffering is another issue we'll run into. I don't understand why I'm feeling this way. There's a thought experiment I like to throw at people. If you think of the person that you love the most, if you've lost anyone, say, really important to you, and that grief still hurts. If someone came up with a pill that would erase it forever, would you take it? And most people say, no. Isn't that interesting? I agree too. I wouldn't either. Why? Because the pain has meaning. It means that I was connected to the person that I loved that died. And if I erase that, in a way, I kind of erase the meaning. So the point of all this is that the search for meaning is, and many of the authors have talked about that. Viktor Frankl wrote a whole book called Man's Search for Meaning. And it's great, although I think he didn't quite go far enough. I don't think we search for it. I think we crave it. And it's as strong as this desire for hunger and sex and basic comfort and all of those things. It's that strong. And if it's not met, you're going to feel this angst and this emptiness, and an emptiness that's going to really hurt. Suffering can be mitigated by understanding the meaning of it. But meaninglessness just creates more pain. It doesn't work the other way around. So meaning is actually more fundamental than suffering is. So that's your nugget of wisdom for today. Meaningless can't be endured. Pain can be endured through meaning. So then archetypes can help us with this process. They're resonant. They're easy to remember. So they won't forget them like everything else that you tell them. They can come back and they're like, I don't remember talking about that. No. They're resonant, so they're ready-made to stick in your mind. That dream we've returned to multiple times in my therapy with her. They're independently invented, and so they feel kind of timeless and eternal. Since they're expressions of meaning, they can mitigate meaninglessness, like I said, if they're taken seriously. If you just go, wow, I must have had too much pizza last night, you know, blah, 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 then they're not taking it seriously. And they connect us to others and even the past and the ancestors, right? That might carry some weight with your patients. Now, humankind has discovered this across the ages, right? And we store tons of this stuff in common cultural expressions like religions, philosophies, even things like transitional objects, right? Children are automatically used. The blanket represents mom or whatever. And then myths and dreams, of course, are expressions of meaning. They work, like I said, more like a compass rather than so much a map. And the analogy I give to explain what I mean by this is language. Use example of language. Children, when they start to learn how to talk, the first thing they do is babble. They just blah, 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 duh, duh, duh. Well, what they're learning there during that teaching themselves, by the way, is that sound that they're hearing is associated temporally with the configuration of the mouth and the pharynx. They do it a bunch of times. That's why they keep doing it. Blah, 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 blah. They're training themselves. All right, it's an instinct. Well, sooner or later they hear somebody else make that same sound, and now all of a sudden they know how to make that sound too. They taught themselves, so they start repeating what you're saying. They don't know what the meaning of the word are yet. That comes later. But the point is that they gradually teach themselves whatever language they happen to be swimming around in, without having to be taught to do that. They do it automatically. Learning to write and read, though, takes years of practice and focused study. It's not effortless like learning a language is. So they just start talking. I mean, do they never stop once they start? So archetypes are both spontaneously generated by individuals, but they can also, of course, because they're resonant, be retold. And there's lots of examples of this, like, someone presents a dream and then the whole tribe will hear it and they'll start telling it over and over again. And a lot of times that gets added onto over the centuries too. So it becomes its own kind of thing. And it kind of gets more and more distilled because the same processes are going into the retelling as the telling was. So that's how that works. I'd like to thank everybody. This has been a great place to work. I'm so happy that I was able to work with everyone here, the whole faculty, the residents, the students. I only can hope to bring the same high quality standard of excellence that you guys maintain here in my next position. And look me up if you got questions about anything, or if you have some weird off the wall subject, I'm your guy. So questions. I might need help with this question exam answer thing. Anyone? See a chat. No. I just flabbergasted everybody. They're stunned into silence.
Erik, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
It's really more of an invitation to comment than a specific question. Jung himself was a fascinating person in his personal life and experiences, in the controversies about his activities up to and during World War II, his relationship with Freud, his own psychiatric history, and the famous book of his musings, jottings, and illustrations. So there's a lot to chew on with him personally.
Yeah, that's for sure.
He has been described as not just a scientist and psychiatrist, but also a bit of a mystic.
Oh, yeah.
Your description of the concept of archetype was very elucidating, and I enjoyed it a great deal. Others have presented it in much more mystical terms.
Oh,
and
yes.
I wonder if you can sort of comment on that counterpoint.
Fantastic question. I wanted to try to keep it focused as best I could on what I think they are, but that's one chunk of the scholarship out there. Like you said, there are a lot of folks that take the idea and they just run wild with it. In my opinion, they're a little sloppy. But at the same time, I kind of understand why they do it, because one of the things about Jung is that he was very much opposed to trying to reduce the human experience to, in his words, a set of algebraic equations. He was violently against that sort of idea. And it was always, his whole life, he skirted on the borderline between science and religion, which in his day, and still to a degree today, are both presented as if they were opposing forces when they need not be. But oftentimes you'll see them described as like godlike beings and all that sort of thing. And there might be something to that. I'd have to do a whole nother presentation on philosophy of mind and where I think that might go. But I'm trying to stick with the biological side, because he started with that, and try to keep it based and connected to what we do know. And when you do that, I think it tends to be pretty useful, and if some folks out there like to, wax grandiloquent about it and go off into other dimensions with it, I can't stop them, but I do question kind of how useful that could be. As far as his personal life goes, he did some definitely dicey stuff with his patients, like a lot of the gang that started the whole psychoanalytic enterprise. Sometimes you have to try to separate the art from the artist, as it were. That's like 2 more presentations just on that subject.
There's a question from online here. It's on the chat.
Oh, it is. Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
Read it out, or you can just read it.
Okay, yeah, I'll read it. So it's the question about the genetic basis for archetypes. Do you think they're encoded in the genetic code by selection pressures, resulting in changes in gene sequence, or do you think it's possible that our experience can be encoded in our genome due to epigenetic changes? I watched a lecture by a modern-day hermeticist. That's a branch of philosophy / mysticism, to be very vague about it. And he proposed our experience can be encoded into our journalized through epigenetic changes. He referenced a recent mouse study in Nature that showed olfactory phobias can be passed on through generations. So my answer to that is yes, both. And the genetic, so like a lot of the stuff that I talked about today are stuff that's probably just in the genome. It's a predisposition, right? It's not necessarily an encoding in the sense that it's got a roadmap or a blueprint per se, but rather that the genome is sort of like, I'm going to build these structures and you're going to probably end up here. In the same way that bipedal locomotion is built into the system, right? So we teach ourselves how to walk very slowly, but if you'll notice, it's not an accident because the entire physiology is oriented around the whole idea that you're going to be walking upright. So the angle of the spine with the skull is what it is because we need to be able to look around this way and not walking around straight up, like we would be if we were quadrupeds. The curvature of the spine, the organization of the valves, so forth. So it's all organized with that in mind, right? So that's how I think it works genetically. Now, what our question asker here, Nick, is asking is, what about events finding themselves into, attached to the genome and being passed on? And so the studies that they're referring to here is really the epigenetic inheritance of acquired characteristics, or neo-Lamarckianism. It's really cool. And then what happens is that events seem to be able to get, they seem to be able to mark the genome through epigenetic modifications. So acetylation, for example, is one. The change of certain types of proteins, histone proteins, different types of RNA, all of this stuff can be modified so that they get passed on to the next generation. I've seen the studies on this that look at depression, that look at the immune system changes and how that possibly affects mental health. So I think we're at the very beginnings of this stuff, but I do think that probably happens. And every time I give a lecture on this, especially to psychologists that do lots of therapy, I get lots of nodding and like, oh yeah, that's what that is. Okay. Because what that was sometimes described to me is they'll have a patient and they just, at some point, it seemed like they reached this wall of depression that doesn't make any sense, except that somehow it was passed on, right? This genetic thing that happened to the parents or grandparents. I've read some reports of folks that gave therapy to grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, for example, and that the challenges that were inherent in that, even if they didn't hear of or in any way experience it, it seemed as though it somehow got marked and they inherited that. How many generations does that last? I have no idea, but we're still learning about it. So great question. And there's the study they're putting in there. What else? Yeah.
So for kind of a maybe earlier residency question, but we have a lot of primary psychotic disorder patients who have so much difficulty with language and verbal expression. How would you, maybe not even in therapy, how would you approach kind of trying to get the information that you have to get with somebody who really struggles with that verbal expression?
Well, the question you're asking, it also applies to children. And that whole field of sand play therapy originated from a lot of Jung's ideas on, they can't articulate it that well, but they can draw pictures or they can organize the little scene on the sand pit to help them express what's going on. And if you don't understand the way the metaphors are working, then you might miss this stuff. So that's how it's useful. I mean, but I have all of my patients, at some point or another, I'll have them draw pictures of how they feel. Just let it be free form, and it always produces interesting stuff. And oftentimes it's very archetypal in nature. Like I had one patient who described her experience as being behind a wall of ice. Right, so I've got the separation, the darkness, and the ice all tied into that right at the start. And then, of course, because it's an image and a metaphor, and it's so easy and resonant, you can use it later in therapy. It's like, oh, it seems like maybe we're cracking the ice a little bit here. And they know immediately what you're talking about. And it's a way to communicate on a different channel. It can be very powerful and evocative. Great question. Yeah.
So this is two questions. The first one.
No, you're only allowed one, sorry.
Oh.
I'm just kidding.
Which one which? I guess the first one relates more to Nick's question.
Yeah.
I guess I was reading a little bit about this beforehand because I was very clueless about the collective unconscious. And I read that there's been some recent research on whether the gut microbiome contributes in a way to.
Oh, I believe that. Yeah. I don't know much about it, but it makes sense that it could incorporate somehow that way too, as a part of what you inherit. Is not just the genome, but all the stuff that got attached to the genome plus everything else biological. The mistake people make is when they assume. Now, you know, I've had debates about this stuff with other scholars, and a lot of times they'll come to something like, well, sure, Dr. Goodwyn, but you're talking about this physiological stuff, or it's behavioral. I'm talking about cognition, right? That's totally different. Like, yeah, you're delusional, man. They're all connected. It's, you know, you can't just pull it out like that, you know. So I'm sure that could have some effect. What? I don't know, but anyway, what's your other question?
This one's a bit. I guess with the rise of technology, this more modern age, how it's changed how we interact with other people and how we see ourselves. Do you feel like that can change some of the archetypes or add to them?
Okay, so great question. Can archetypes change over time? And if you'll remember, the archetype is the image, right? So I'm talking about the things that build the image of the innate metaphors. Those are probably not going to change in a short period of time. That would take a long time. Like, so like the association of light with safety, and unless our visual system changes, right, then it's not likely to change that. But all I'm saying though is that we inherit this alphabet of metaphors. Now, through your life, the psyche can organize them in all kinds of different ways. It's very creative this way. And there's a strong pressure for the psyche to do that very thing, to create these things. Why? Because they help organize our lives and make sense of it. So what that means then, if we start encountering a situation that's maybe new to us in evolutionary terms, then the response may be new, one that's not been seen much before. So it's possible. Now, I think it's probably not likely that you're going to have a dream that no one's ever dreamed before on that level, you know. But you never know. It's a fair question to say, you know, let's leave that possibility open. I think we got another one here.
Yeah, so when patients with autism spectrum disorder, for example, that have a difficult time crafting those meanings, do they have a different archetypal structure, or is it still the same, but they interpret it differently, so we have to change the way we address them? Have you kind of run into anything like that, or?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. The same alphabet is going to be inherited, but the way that they use it is going to be, I think, different, and you have to be flexible in that case. I mean, most of what I've talked about is normally developing processes, and that's not normally developing. It's slightly different development, you know, and their verbal skills oftentimes are impaired. So, but that said, verbal skill and verbal communication is way newer than all the other types of communication that we use. That's why facial expressions, for example, are recognizable in animals to a degree. I mean, because they represent these nonverbal types of communication. that are kind of baked into the genome. So that stuff's probably not affected that much. But I do think it's fair to say that you would need to account for that if you're trying to interpret their expressions. We had another question over here.
Yeah, she's gonna ask the same question. I have.
Okay, same answer then, ditto.
The only thing I was gonna say about that was like the Kiki and Bobo experiment. I'm not sure if you've heard that.
The which ones?
Kiki and Bobo, there's like this, it was done in children across the world, actually, in different cultures. And what they did was they drew two images, one that was very sharp angled, and one that was like kind of soft, circular. And they told kids, one of these is Kiki, one of these is Bobo. And across cultures, across languages, most kids can identify one of the sharp angles as Kiki, the one soft angle is Bobo. But the only statistically significant change was the kid's autism. They couldn't identify that.
Huh, that's interesting. I'm not sure what that means, but
And I think that's more of a language thing, there, but I think that you're representative of an archetypal difference in people's autism because they're how they process data and how they interpret data. Just
it is very different, yeah. Now, languages, is you bring that up. Oftentimes, or for a long time, linguists asserted that the difference between different language and meaning connections, like sound and meaning links, was utterly arbitrary. But there are some studies that show that's actually not the case. That if you give, if you take a particular, take a subject and try to have them match sounds and meanings, it works out better than just random chance. So there's some links in there that seem like they're more likely than others. So it's kind of related to what you're saying. What else? Any more questions on the chat? No. More messages from the beyond? Okay. All right.
Thank you.